We're recording this interview on February 8th, that's Tuesday, and as of today, the Freedom Convoy, so-called, has been in Ottawa for 11 days, basically occupying the nation's capital. The Coutts blockade has been up at the border crossing there for about the same time. And yesterday, another blockade went up on the border crossing at Windsor and Detroit. Canadians are nervously wondering when the next one will be coming. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau so far has been, tough rhetoric, but he hasn't done much. And the pressure is mounting for him to act. And the question then becomes, well, what are his options? What can he do? I'm going to discuss that with political scientist Dr. Stewart Prest from Fraser University. So welcome to the interview, Stewart.
Well, thanks for having me on.
Okay, well, let me pose you the question. What options does the Prime Minister have to consider?
I mean, unfortunately, there's no magic wand, no easy solution here. So this is one of those moments where we have to start our conversation with the fact that Canada is a federal country, and the federal government does not have direct jurisdiction over anything transpiring there right now. They have some choices about how to get involved. Normally, it operates through a matter of being invited in. And so if there is a request for assistance, say from the provincial government declaring a state of emergency, if the municipal government makes a request to the provincial government, and so on, you get this game of telephone where a request for additional assistance would trigger a response, and we could see an escalation to use federal forces that include the armed forces. But I think that is a last resort option. The only way the federal government can trigger a response like that would be to invoke something like the Emergencies Act. Not something like, would it be to invoke the Emergencies Act? And that is very much a measure of last resort. We haven't seen anything like that really since the FLQ crisis to respond to a moment of civil unrest. And so it's a nation-defining event if and when that ever happens. And I don't think the federal government seems to have any appetite for that kind of approach. And it's not even clear that would be the most effective response here, to see this an escalation of this already tense situation. But that said, the status quo is also clearly not working. And so the federal government, aside from direct intervention, waiting to be for a request to provide additional assistance, the other measures they can take are, in some ways, taking advantage of the bully pulpit is something the Prime Minister could do right now. And we started to see the Prime Minister finally doing something like that last night in the emergency debate. But that's very late in coming to the party. These are saying things that could have been said weeks and months ago. And so to some extent, we're looking back on what could have been done differently as well.
Now, Stewart, one of the information that's come to light in the last few days that's very concerning is the role of foreign actors in these blockades. So we've seen the role of foreign contributions to the GoFundMe campaign. I mean, basically, the the Trump supporters down in the US have been supporting the blockade with money. There's suspicions that the other actors, malicious actors perhaps, have been active on social media and in other forms, fomenting this kind of unrest. Does that not give the federal government more justification for intervening?
Well, through Canada's intelligence agencies, there are measures in place where those agencies can take measures to try to interdict or prevent foreign-based operations that are targeting aspects of the Canadian democratic system. So this is legislation that's been put in place relatively recently. So that does give some additional resources here, and in some ways, this is a first test to see whether those measures are sufficient and whether they are providing the kind of support necessary to deal with the kinds of threats that Canadians are dealing with. That is all going to be happening behind closed doors, though. So it is very difficult to assess whether that is something the federal government is already doing, or whether something they're contemplating, whether they're coordinating with local actors to respond to that funneling of resources. And there is also this this other aspect is the problem of trying to halt foreign interference. It's very difficult to do. Shut down the GoFundMe source of funding, and then another one pops up right away. So money tends to be very fungible. It's like water; it tends to find a way through the cracks. And so that is certainly something that the federal government can do, and is likely looking for ways to try to tamp down. But it's definitely going to be an uphill struggle there as well.
Now, two of the blockades we talked about are at border crossings, and one of them is an international border crossing. Sorry, both of them are at Coutts and Windsor. Doesn't that give the federal government a little more leverage here, or a little more authority, to stop the impeding of traffic going through the border?
There is a jurisdictional issue there, and if the blockade it really is hampering the ability of the Canadian Border Services to maintain the correct operations of the border, then that agency would have some additional ability to intervene there. But it is something of a gray area, even when we saw other areas instances when federal agents have been involved in policing Canada's borders. There's very quickly a moment where that transfers back towards to provincial jurisdiction. Essentially, there are carefully defined areas, say within airports and so on, where it's a border services or responsibility, and they have specific actions they can take to meet certain means. But the general providing of safety within provincial boundaries is a provincial constitutional responsibility. And so that is specifically an area where the federal government may intervene, but it's not going to solve this broader issue. And of course, the blockade can simply move several blocks over and be established in purely provincial jurisdiction as well. So I think the federal government would have some means to intervene there, but it's not going to be, again, it's not a magic wand to allow them to intervene there.
Well, let's talk about the politics of this. We saw today one of the Liberal MPs, the backbencher, criticizing his own government for basically asking them, I guess, to come to the negotiating table, as if the federal government can negotiate with people who are undertaking a blockade. But what should the prime minister be saying? I mean, should he get tougher? Should he suggest some sort of negotiation, mediation, take a middle of the road? The CPC on the right has clearly aligned itself with the blockaders and the Freedom Convoy, the occupiers of Ottawa. That doesn't seem not likely he's going to go there or would want to go there. So what are his political options here?
Well, I think it is useful to take a second to look backwards and say what could have been done differently, because I think there were a couple of significant mistakes here that got us to this point. We don't get to a moment like this without effectively multiple mistakes being made along the way. And I think one of the things we can point to is that while this protest, this occupation is illegitimate. It's a clear upending of the rule of law in Ottawa in a way that goes far beyond protest and is infringing on the rights of other Canadians. So it's clearly gone too far in that sense. One of the reasons why it enjoys this support is that a lot of Canadians are really frustrated with where things are, and they're just tired and looking for somebody to say, this is the way through how we're going to get from here to something that looks, again, more like normalcy. And government for the last 6 months, year and a half has been pretty reactive, in contrast with the kinds of statements we were hearing from public health agencies and so on early in the pandemic, where we're saying, well, here's where we are, and then laying out pretty clear roadmaps, not saying on this date we're going to change, but there is a moment where we're going to have a different kind of opening up of society. And that kind of communication, that kind of road mapping, that's sort of, this is not just get your vaccination and then eventually everything will be okay. This is how we're going to get through this to something that we can be more comfortable with. And we haven't really heard that communication, even as the situation has been changing fairly dramatically in some ways with the rise of Omicron. The fact that just about every Canadian will know somebody probably within their inner circle now who has had COVID. So everyone is having this kind of conversation. So what happens from here? And we haven't had any kind of coordinating response from the prime minister or from most provincial leaders either, to say this is the roadmap, and we don't know exactly when we're going to hit this moment, but here, this is the situation change, and here's how we're changing along with it. It's just been this sort of reactive moment. And so when somebody shows up with this primal scream of rage, that echoes with a lot of people saying, yeah, I'm really sick of this. And we finally heard the Prime Minister say last night that the pandemic has sucked for Canadians, which it has. And to sort of give voice to that, I think that is a piece where the Prime Minister can do something to really acknowledge that everyone is frustrated, and then to start to map out really actively saying, this is how we're going to walk through this, not just by hoping everyone gets their booster, but we have a plan for where we're going. And then on top of that, really wrapping himself up in this idea of respect for the rule of law. The Conservative Party, just in pure politics, has, since the departure of Erin O'Toole, it really wrapped itself up in embrace of this movement, this effectively what has become an unlawful movement. And so the Prime Minister can oppose that, saying we create spaces for protest and discussion and discourse, but not like this. We're not going to infringe on the rights of other Canadians to make our political points in this unending sort of way. And so really taking a stand and encouraging provincial leaders and municipal leaders to act aggressively to resolve the situation, to get to a point where all Canadians can live freely once again, ironically enough.
Now, I want to paint a hypothetical for you, because I think this is a very real chance that this hypothetical will come true. The last couple, maybe 3 waves, we've seen governments ramp up restrictions during the wave, and then relax them as the numbers started to go down, and that leads then, a couple months later, we have another wave. So we see the provincial governments who are responsible for public health doing exactly the same thing they've done over the last 2 or 3 waves, which leads some observers, including me, to think that this spring we will have a 6th wave. And the response to that primarily comes from the provinces. And the Prime Minister here is a bit hamstrung. I mean, he can perhaps influence, but he can't order, he can't direct. And yet he has to deal with the political fallout of these decisions out at the provincial level. What might he do? What should he do, anticipating that hypothetical situation that may very well come true?
It's a good question. And again, given the federal structure, just as you described so well there is no easy answer. But what the Prime Minister, what the federal government can do is it can provide a coordinating point. And this is a key point. They can legitimate, they can provide space for other governments to build a response. And this is one of the problems with the Prime Minister's extended silence. I don't think it would have been useful to meet with the protesters, people calling effectively for his trial or worse. I mean, these are people they're not calling for rational demands. I don't think a negotiation with that crowd is going to do anything other than legitimate this kind of tactic further. But at the same time, trying to communicate that there is a path forward, and helping people to understand that in much the same way that the Prime Minister did in a very vigorous sort of way early in the pandemic, with all of those press conferences outside of the Rideau Cottage there. And that was a continual measure of accountability and providing answers. The answers weren't always satisfactory, but they were there. They were visible. This idea that there is leadership there, and there is active coordination between governments, and to really try to bring the provinces together to really map out what is the path forward here. How can we routinize the dealing with any subsequent wave that comes along? That is a real possibility, but we also have this reality that many Canadians are double, triple vaxxed, and they're looking for ways of asking themselves, how do I get back to a kind of stable normalcy in my life where we can roll with anything that comes along? And so what does that look like? Let's map it out, and let's make it clear that we are balancing the needs to keep society as open as possible for those who can and continue their lives, but still maintaining the protections necessary for those more vulnerable populations. It's going to be a balance, and really address it clearly. This is how we're going to approach it, and here's how we're going to work with our provincial counterparts to get Canada to that point, because this kind of reactive uncertainty is not doing anyone favors, other than perhaps those looking to organize things like a trucker protest.
So if I understand you correctly, Stewart, what you're suggesting is that the Prime Minister and the federal government going forward really has 2 options here, or 2 approaches that it should take. One is try to coordinate the premiers better so that we have a less reactive approach to what seems like an inevitable 6th wave now. So that's one. And then the other is this messaging, this politicking, to create some kind of, consistent response, consistent messaging, rally Canadians around, the ongoing fight against the COVID-19. And that's basically what he can do. There isn't much else. Have I got that correct?
I think those are two important pieces. The third important piece is to really reinforce the need to respect ultimately the rule of law, to create space for discourse over those points of view. And there are people, including people who are inclined to vote Liberal, who are really tired of the pandemic. People's minds are changing about just what seems like an acceptable level of restriction going forward. So let's have that conversation. Let's convene that conversation, but do so actively, not because a group of people drove a bunch of very large trucks into Ottawa and said, we're not leaving until you remove the restrictions. That is not how democracy works. There is a discussion, and this is one of the problems, is that discussion probably should have happened earlier, and enough people got fed up enough that we see this action taken. That discussion still needs to happen, and now it feels like it's happening under duress. So we need to, first of all, remove the duress. So rule of law has to be restored, and then we have this discussion about how are we going to move forward as a country, and not as a country, and not because we're being compelled to, because that's not how democracy works, but because we need to come to some sort of operating consensus as a country.
Stewart, this has been very insightful. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.